morning, dear students. We are starting with one of the important chapters of biology, that is cell, the unit of life, from class 9th. In this chapter, by the name of cell, we will have a discussion on the definition of cell, what cell means actually. We will discuss the discovery related to the cells. Then we will discuss the parts of the cell, starting from cell wall to plasma membrane to cytoplasm, nucleus and other structures which are present inside a prokaryotic cell or in a eukaryotic cell. In the chapter also, we have to discuss a bit about different types of cell divisions, namely mitosis and meiosis. So, let's begin with the topic, cell, the unit of life. What cell first means? As we all know, every complex structure is made up of smaller blocks, which are called building blocks or which we call as structural units. For example, in order to make a building, in order to make a wall, we are in need of bricks. So we will take the bricks, we will put them together and we will make finally a structure in the form of building or in the form of a wall. Same, to make a chalk, we have to take unlimited number of dust particles together, chalk particles together, we will combine them together and these chalk particles finally make a complex structure called chalk. Same way, to make an iron nail, there should be iron atoms which combine together to make an iron object. So I can say atom is the building block of that very iron object. Same way, every living organism is made up of small building blocks or structural units which will be called a cell. Suppose my body is made up of unlimited number of some small structures which are considered as structural and building blocks of my body. Those structural building blocks will be called the cell. So by definition, cell is the structural and functional unit of life. The smallest structure in which life can exist is a cell. So cell is structural and functional unit of life capable of independent existence. Capable of independent existence. Let me explain what this capable of independent existence means. We have suppose an organism. This organism is made up of cells, and cells themselves are made of subcellular parts, smaller units called cell organelles. For example, we have a cell organelle called mitochondria. If we will take mitochondria out of the cell and will provide all the necessary conditions for its functioning, still mitochondria cannot work outside the cell. So I can say mitochondria is not independent unit of life. But if we will take a cell and we will provide all the necessary conditions for its existence, then cell is capable of surviving independent of the body of the organism. So we can say that cells are the smallest units of life. They are the smallest units that represent life. They are the smaller units in which life occurs and are capable of independent existence. So we will keep in mind that all living organisms are made up of smaller structural units, small building blocks called cells, and these cells are capable of independent existence. Suppose in my body, if I will take out the bone marrow cell, the cell that lies inside the bones, in the cavity of the bones, I will take out that cell and I will provide all the necessary conditions required for its existence, then that bone marrow cell can exist independent of my body. So that bone marrow cell is the smallest unit that can represent life. So we can explain cell by saying cells are the structural and functional units of life, units of the living organisms capable of independent existence. So every living organism, may it be a bacteria, may it be complex like humans, may it be blue whale, may it be elephant, may it be a very big tree, all these living organisms are made up of smaller units which are called cells. Now, after the definition of cell, you will keep in mind that all the living organisms are made up of smaller units, all those units will be called the cells. Now coming to the discovery of the cell, cell was first discovered in 1665 by a scientist named Robert Hooke. What he did, he took bark of a tree, it was Spanish oak tree, Quercus robust. So he took bark of a tree and with the help of his self-made microscope, he observed the bark of the tree under it. What he found, that this bark is made up of smaller compartments, smaller room-like structures looking like honeycomb. He called each of these compartment as cell. So cells were first discovered in 1665 by a scientist named Robert Hooke when he took bark of an oak tree, observed it under his self-made microscope, and he found that bark is made up of small room-like structures which looked like honeycomb, and he named each of this individual structure as cell. So cells were first discovered by Robert Hooke in the form of small room-like structures, small compartment-like structures present in the bark of oak tree, and he called these as cells. But keep in mind, Robert Hooke observed bark of the tree, and this bark of the tree is made of dead cells. So bark of the plant is made up of totally dead cells. So what these dead cells contain? There is no plasma membrane. We'll discuss about these terms later on. So there is no covering called plasma membrane. Inner fluid which we call as protoplasm that has been dried up. So Robert Hooke in fact did not study the entire cell. What he studied was just the cell wall. So Robert Hooke thus is credited to have discovered and studied dead cells for the first time. So he discovered cell for the first time, but the cells that were discovered were the dead cells. So Robert Hooke discovered cells for the first time, but the dead cells, these cells were the dead cells. So Robert Hooke discovered dead cells for the first time from the bark of oak tree. Then in 1674, one more scientist by the name of A.V. Leeuwenhoek. What he did, with the help of microscope, he studied living cells for the first time. Like he studied bacteria, he studied human sperms, he studied WBCs, etc. And thus is credited to have discovered living cell for the first time. So if the question is asked, who discovered cells for the first time? So it is Robert Hooke. But if the question is, who discovered living cells for the first time? Then it is A.V. Leeuwenhoek in 1674 when he studied bacteria, sperms and WBCs under his microscope, and thus is credited to have discovered living cells for the first time. Now coming to some more points related to the discovery of cells. In 1831, a scientist by the name of Robert Brown, what he did, he discovered a prominent and a spherical structure from a eukaryotic cell, and he named it as nucleus. So in 1831, in addition to Robert Hooke's discovery, A.V. Leeuwenhoek's discovery, information about the cells is being accumulated. In 1831, Robert Brown studied nucleus. So you will see there is a cell, a eukaryotic cell, there is a prominent structure controlling each and every activity of the cell, and that structure was discovered and named nucleus by Robert Brown. Then in 1838, a scientist called Purkinje, he discovered a fluid inside the cell. He found that cell has a fluid inside it, and he named it as protoplasm. So there is a living fluid inside the cell, and this living fluid was discovered by Purkinje in 1838. Then in 1838, a scientist by the name of Sheldon and one more scientist by the name of Schwann, in 1839, what they did, they accumulated whole information about the cells that was given by Robert Hooke, by Robert Brown, by A.V. Leeuwenhoek, by Purkinje and other scientists. In fact, they also put some important information related to plant and animal cells. All that information was collected and was put forth in the form of a theory which is called Sheldon-Schwann cell theory, or simply we may call it as cell theory. So what is cell theory? Cell theory is a theory that explains different features of the cell, and it was given by Sheldon-Schwann in 1839. What they postulated in their cell theory, first important point, they said cells are the structural and functional units of life. Cells are structural and functional units of life. So it was first postulate in their theory by the name of cell theory. In addition to this, what they said every cell is a mass of protoplasm, which we already mentioned, that cell internally has a fluid inside it which will be called a protoplasm, different from cytoplasm that we will discuss ahead. So they said every cell is a mass of protoplasm. So there is a fluid called protoplasm, different from cytoplasm, protoplasm. They said there is nucleus, because it was already discovered by Robert Brown. So they said every cell is a mass of protoplasm containing a nucleus, plasma membrane, with or without cell wall, because we already know that plant cells, and in your earlier classes you might have gone through these things, animal cells don't have a cell wall, but plant cells, in addition to plasma membrane, they also possess cell wall. So cell wall is optional, it may or may not be present, but cell membrane, protoplasm and nucleus, it is feature of majority of the cells. Now nucleus can be absent in bacteria, but normally the research was based on eukaryotic cell. So what they said in their second postulate, every living cell is a mass of protoplasm containing nucleus. So nucleus will be there in majority of cells, containing nucleus, plasma membrane, with or without cell wall. Third postulate that they put forth was functions of a living organism or functions of the cell. What does that mean? If a plant is able to make its own food by the process of photosynthesis, it is in fact not the plant body that is making the food, it is the plant cells that are making the food. If in a particular organism or maybe in a plant, cells are not capable of carrying photosynthesis, That function you cannot see in the living organism. So you can see and observe only those activities in a living organism which are present inside the cells. Or I can say the activities of the living organism are in fact activities of the cell. For example, we have a child growing up. It is not the child who is growing up. It is in fact the size of cells, number of cells that is growing up. So functions of a living organism are functions of the cell. If I can say why you are not capable of carrying photosynthesis, you will say, sir, our cells are not capable of carrying photosynthesis, so our body cannot show this activity. So this is the functions of a living organism or functions of the cell. One more postulate related to this. They said the shape and size of the cell is dependent upon the functions it carries. For example, we have WBCs. They are somewhat amoeba-like, called amoeboid, because they have to change their shape so that they may go into the tissue spaces to kill pathogens there. We have RBCs which have to move quickly in the blood, so for that they have to be some disc-like. We have neurons, they have to be very long so that quickly they can send messages from one part of the body to another. So they said shape and size of the cell is dependent on functions it carry. Functions it carry. So what will be the shape of the cell is dependent upon the nature of functions it has to carry. Fifth postulate, that is, they said omnis cellula e cellula. What does that mean? Suppose we have a cell here, we have a cell here. This cell might have come from pre-existing cell. So there is a cell that divides, gives rise to new cells, that again grow, divide, gives rise to. So we can, it doesn't apply only to the cells, it applies to living organisms as well. Like I am from my pre-existing individuals called my parents. My parents are from their pre-existing individuals called their parents or my grandparents. So same way, though it was not said by Sheldon and Schwann, it was said by a scientist in 1855 called Rodolphe Virchow, that was also added later on in cell theory. So another important point we will mention here, all cells arise from pre-existing cell. So if we have a cell here, definitely there might have been a pre-existing cell from where this cell originated. So new cells originate from pre-existing cells, and it was said by Rodolphe Virchow in 1855. So let me recapitulate it. Sheldon and Schwann collected whole of the information, all the information related to cells, and put forth a theory which is called Sheldon-Schwann cell theory, or simply we may call it a cell theory. What were the important postulates of the cell theory? First, they said all living organisms are made up of cells, and cells are the structural and functional units of the life. Then they said every cell is a mass of protoplasm having a nucleus in it, surrounded by a plasma membrane with or without cell wall. Then next they said functions of a living organism are the functions of the cell. Then one more, shape and size of the cells is dependent upon the functions it carry. And the last feature, which in fact was later on added in 1855 by Rodolphe Virchow to the cell theory, that was new cells arise from pre-existing cells. This was about cell theory. We will continue with one more topic, that is types of living organisms on the basis of number of cells in their body. So let's continue with types of organisms on the basis of number of cells. So on the basis of number of cells in a living organism, we have two types of living organisms. One, we have unicellular organisms, and second, we have multicellular organisms. So we have unicellular organisms and multicellular organisms. Uni means one, cellular is related to cell. So what are unicellular organisms? These are those organisms in which body is made up of just one cell. I can say this is one cell. It is not in fact the cell, it is representing an organism as well. So those organisms in which entire body is made up of one cell, all the functions of the body are carried by the single cell. The single cell is one individual, one organism. Such organisms are called unicellular organisms. So we can say unicellular organisms are those organisms that are made of only one cell. Multi means many, cellular is related to cell. So what will be multicellular organisms? These are those organisms in which body is made up of more than one cell, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe trillions. Like body of an adult human is made up of 100 trillion cells, so we are multicellular. So these are those organisms made of more than one cell, maybe thousands and trillions, made of more than one cell. In this, we can say in a unicellular organism, all the functions are carried by a single cell, whether it is digestion, whether it is absorption, whether any process, whether it is reproduction, any process that the organism has to carry will be carried by that very cell that makes the organism. So I can say all body activities are carried by a single cell. And in multicellular organisms, like in our body, we have different groups of cells. We have one group of cells for one function, we have another group of cells. For example, we have epithelial cells just to make an external and internal protective covering. We have muscle cells just to help us in locomotion movement. We have nerve cells that send messages and receive messages of the body. So here, all body activities are carried by a single cell. Here, different types of cells are specialized to carry different body functions. Different sets of cells, and in another class, in another chapter, we'll discuss that this set of cells we call as tissue. So different sets of cells carry different functions on the basis of their specialization. Like muscle cells are specialized to help locomotion movement. Epithelial cells are specialized to provide protection. So here, different sets of cells carry different body functions on the basis of their specialization. Let's add some examples here. In unicellular organisms, we have bacteria. So bacteria is made up of just one cell. So bacteria is a unicellular organism. We have amoeba, again a unicellular organism that keeps on changing its shape. We have paramecium, we have euglena, we have chlamydomonas, plasmodium, monocystis, and so on. We have unlimited number of living organisms which are unicellular. And in multicellular, we have certain examples you can give: dog, human, apple tree, maize plant, housefly, and so on. All these living organisms will be considered as multicellular organisms. So keep in mind that on the basis of number of cells in a living organism, we have two types of living organisms. One unicellular, another multicellular. Unicellular will be any organism in which entire body is made up of just one cell. We'll call it as unicellular. But in multicellular, the body will be made up of more than one cell, which can be in hundreds, thousands, or in trillions. In unicellular, all the body activities are carried by a single cell. But in a multicellular organism, there are different sets of cells, each specialized to carry a particular body function. In this we have bacteria, amoeba, paramecium, euglena, and so on. All are the examples of unicellular organisms. And here in multicellular, we have dog, we have human, we have apple tree, we have maize, we have housefly, all these which are made up of more than one cell. So normally multicellular organisms majority can be seen without using any microscope. But since they are made up of just one cell, unicellular organisms, in majority of cases what we require microscope to see them, because cells are very small, so you may not be able to see a single cell. But when large number of cells gather up, they accumulate, they pool up, they make a bigger structure called a multicellular organism that can be seen without using microscope. So this was unicellular and multicellular organism. We will continue with one more topic, that is cell organelles and the different cell organelles which are present in a typical cell, starting with the cell wall. Then we may proceed to some other organelles. So let us start with cell organelles and different types of cell organelles. Cell organelles. Like you see in chemistry, whole of the matter is made up of some building blocks called atoms. Now atoms you can study in greater detail and you will see that atoms are made up of subatomic particles. Same way, we have a living organism. We have a living organism that is made up of smaller units called cells. And now we can say that cells in fact are made up of subcellular structures. They are themselves made up of smaller parts, and these smaller parts will be called cell organelles. So what are cell organelles? I can say cell organelles are subcellular structures of a cell, each having a particular structure and a particular function to carry. So we know all living organisms are made up of cells. Cells themselves are made up of smaller parts, subcellular parts, which are called cell organelles. So we can say cell organelles are the smaller parts of the cell which have a specific structure and specific function to carry. For example, cell has ribosomes, mitochondria, typical cell if we will discuss, ribosome, mitochondria, then there can be plastids, there can be endoplasmic reticulum, there can be lysosomes, there can be Golgi complex and so on. All these structures when taken together they make a cell. That means cell itself is made up of some smaller structures. These smaller structures will be called cell organelle. So cell organelles are subcellular structures. Subcellular means that these are smaller than the cell and they make the cell. When they are taken together they make the cell. So subcellular structures that have a particular structure, each organelle has its own structure that we will discuss later on, have a particular structure and a particular function. So every cell is made up of some smaller parts and each of the part has a specific role, a specific structure, and that smaller parts of the cell, subcellular parts of the cell will be called cell organelles. We have, for example, cell wall, we have cell membrane, we have cytoplasm, we have ER, we have Golgi complex. So all these structures individually make a cell organelle. So when all these cell organelles are taken together in a sophisticated manner, in a systematic manner, they collectively make a cell, and when cells are taken together, they collectively make a living organism. We will discuss these structures one by one, starting with the cell wall, then cell membrane, and the rest of other structures. So let us discuss these organelles one by one, starting with the cell wall. What is cell wall? I can say certain cells, because cell wall is not a universal feature of every cell, certain cells, in addition to plasma membrane, they have a tough, hard covering outside this plasma membrane. This tough, inelastic covering that lies outside the plasma membrane in some types of cells. We will note it down later on what are the different types of cells in which we can observe cell wall. So what cell wall is? Cell wall is a rigid, inelastic covering outside plasma membrane. So plasma membrane will be there, but in addition to plasma membrane, there can be cell wall in some cells. So rigid, inelastic covering outside plasma membrane in some cells to provide, I can say, rigidness, or I can say toughness. This outer inelastic covering in some of the cells outside the plasma membrane will be called cell wall. Now, what are the different types of cells in which we can see cell wall? Cell wall is first seen in bacterial cells. So bacterial cells do have a cell wall, and we will discuss it in higher classes, that it's made up of peptidoglycan. Structure of peptidoglycan is not in your syllabus, that we will discuss in class 11th. So bacteria cells have a cell wall, and that is made up of a complex molecule called the peptidoglycan. In addition to bacterial cells, fungal cells too have a cell wall, and in them cell wall is made up of chitin. Just remember the names, we will not go into the structural details of it. Just remember that cell wall occurs in these types of cells, and there it is made up of this complex molecule. Like I said, bacterial cells have cell wall of peptidoglycan, fungal cells have cell wall of chitin, and plant cells also have a cell wall made of a complex molecule called cellulose. Cell wall, you will see, is absent in protozoa. For example, we have amoeba, we have paramecium, they don't have a cell wall. We have animal cells. Animal cells, both protista, protozoa and animal cells, they don't have cell wall outside the plasma membrane. Now, if certain cells like bacterial cells, fungal cells, plant cells, they possess a cell wall, what is the function of cell wall there? Number first, cell wall in these organisms provide, I can mention it here, in the functions, cell wall here provides shape of the cell. What will be the shape of the cell is dependent upon the shape of the cell wall. Number second, if we will keep an animal cell, cell of a protozoa in water or hypotonic solution, details we will have ahead, water will enter into the cell, that incoming water will exert pressure on the membrane. A time will come when the animal cell or the cell of a protozoa like amoeba will rupture. But if you will keep a bacterial cell or a plant cell in a hypotonic solution, water will enter into it, but still cell will not rupture, because cell wall being very tough will not allow unnecessary expansion of the plasma membrane. Plasma membrane will expand, but once it comes in contact with the cell wall, after that it cannot grow, because cell wall will not allow it to expand beyond limits, because cell wall is rigid. So I can say it prevents rupturing of a bacterial cell or a plant cell when kept in hypotonic solution. When kept in hypotonic solution. So when bacterial cell or a plant cell is kept in hypotonic solution, water enters into it, cell may not rupture because cell wall prevents its rupturing. Then in number third, if any substance have to go into the cell or out of the cell, cell wall should allow it, only then it's possible. So we can say it to some extent helps in transportation of substances. And number fourth and number last, it wards off pathogen. Plant cells are not subjected to too many infections, because cell wall, it removes, it wards off, it throws up the pathogen so that they may not infect the plant body. So this was all about cell wall. This is all for the today. We will continue with some more topics of cell biology, cell the unit of life in the form of plasma membrane, and the rest of the structures. Thank you so much.